I'd like to tell you about the time I was giving one of my first conventions. I don't know if it was in the, trying to think back, it must have been around the 60s. I'm not sure of the date. But as I was teaching when we were on 11th Street in the Village, enough people became interested, and when Fred Rome came down, and he was the biggest, the most wonderful paper folder we knew at the time. He was one of the masters here. We had him come down, and he always chose Election Day because that was the weekend that gave off. And he came down to come, and that's how the convention evolved. I never had more than 30. I had them in my little place on 11th Street, and I fed them. They came in at various times Saturday morning, and everybody had to sit down for a cup of coffee and breakfast, and we got started, and then I served lunch and dinner. And of course, I only have my one table that we eat on and work on. So I remember that when it came noon, I had to say to the people, I'm sorry, will everybody please take a walk for half an hour? Because we had to clean the table and serve the food. And we had a youngster, he was about 13 or 14 at the time, I believe, and that was John Montrole. And he came, and for company, he brought his younger sister, who was about a year younger, because he said he didn't want to come alone. He had her for company. And these two children were so remarkable. I knew nothing about them. I later learned a great deal of surprising things, but at the time, they were just the two young children, and they in no way disturbed the grown-ups. And we folded hour after hour after hour. That it was a grilling thing. You had to really be a lover of origami to be willing to sit at the table hour after hour and concentrate. But these children, we never heard a word from them. They were impeccable. They were so pleasant, and yet they never spoke. And they ate. They stood in line when we served buffet. They didn't ever say anything. And finally, when Saturday night came, I was concerned because everybody was supposed to take care of their own sleeping arrangements, because that I couldn't possibly manage. So I said to the children, where are you going tonight? Are you being taken care of? And they said, oh yes, my father has a friend who lives down at, who teaches at NYU, and he has a place there. We're going to stay the night there. So I was perfectly satisfied. They were called for and brought back on Sunday. But other than that, I never knew they were there, except that they were no trouble. They never asked, how do you do this? All the directions were appropriate. I mean, they could do it. They were no bother at all. They were just wonderful. And they came after that every year when I had my conventions. I call them conventions. Well, you know that I had another marriage. My first husband's name was Kruskal. But people who didn't know me, who knew me recently, only know me as Mrs. Oppenheimer. So this is what happened. John Montrole comes from a family of 10 children. His parents are very, very distinguished scientists. The father is a physicist and a fellow of the American Academy of Science in Washington. Incidentally, my son, Martin David Kruskal, is a fellow of that too. And the Montroles lived in Princeton for a while before they moved up to Syracuse, and then wherever they had moved after that. So they were very intimate with my children, Laura and David Kruskal, in Princeton. But I didn't know them. I don't know my children's friends because we live different lives. It seems that at that time, when my son was head of the department, the Applied Mathematics department, he used to have a colloquium every Friday where he would invite a famous physicist or mathematician or someone famous in the field for the benefit of the students. And they would have a tea at the college. And then if it was a personal friend, he was invited to the home of my son and daughter-in-law for dinner with other guests. And one day, one colloquium was devoted to Dr. Montrole. And when he came back for dinner, and they all sat around the table, there were other guests too invited to meet this illustrious man, my daughter-in-law, Laura, naturally turned to him and said, well, how are the children? Because they had been good friends when they lived in Princeton. And Dr. Montrole said, oh, they're all fine. And, oh, yes, something unusual. My 16-year-old son is publishing a book. So everybody marveled. A book at 16, what does a child of that age have that nobody else knows, that he's so steeped in that he can write a book on the subject? So they said, well, what is he writing it on? Oh, Dr. Montrol said, something I don't believe you've ever heard of, origami. So of course my children whooped, and they said, David said, my mother, Lillian Oppenheimer, started it all in America. And then that was the first time he heard the name Oppenheimer. He didn't know that that was my name, and of course he knew where his children had gone. So isn't that a funny thing that there was, and I had no idea that had they mentioned mathematician to me, that they were going to stay at a mathematician's house overnight, I might have mentioned my son's name, and then they would have known right away. But all the time, neither one knew who I was. I thought that was a funny thing. Well, he didn't, that book took years to publish because the publisher that he had left it with turned out to be a dud. He didn't want to print it, or something happened after he held it for a couple of years. So he went to, John Montrol went to Dover, and this was the result of that, this origami for the enthusiast. And this boy is so remarkable. He has such a facility for making them extremely difficult. That's a field, because usually nobody ones. But Dover does such a beautiful book. The printing, the color, and the models are done so beautifully, and the price is so inexpensive that anybody can pick it up. Nice, big, open models. So Dover took it and really made money on it because he sold so many that soon John had a second book. And this was called Animal Origami for the Enthusiasts, so that it would be connected with the first one. And I'm afraid that John didn't make much money because this is a reprint house and never pays the authors anything as a rule. In fact, they never used to print any books by living authors. And so John has had a career, and now he's on his third book, which he says he's going to do himself. He wants to be his own publisher. He has a brother who's willing to take his pictures of all the models, and a sister who can help him with the drawings, which I think he does himself now. And we're also excited about the third book when it was announced last year, that most of us gave him the money already for the book. Well, it still isn't out. His brother that was interested went to law school, and he was so involved with what he was doing that he kept putting off helping John. But we all have our thumbs crossed that we're going to get that third book in the near future. But that's the joke about John, and he's wonderful. He is a producer and so prolific. He has enough in his mind and probably on paper for 2 or 3 more books. He's a most creative young man. He's brilliant in his field. What he would like to do is to be his own publisher now, and I thought that was interesting. When I first met Robin Harben, and then I had the permission from him to call him Ned, which was his real name, and I felt I was really one of his intimates when he allowed me to call him Ned. He was born in South Africa, but he lived most of his life in England, and he was I think he was the 7th greatest magician in the world, because I remember a show that was put on for television, and it was the 12 of the biggest magicians in the world, and he was one of them. He was the man, you know how they saw the woman in half, that trick? Well, he perfected one where the woman is sawed in thirds. And he did print a large book many, many years ago, which then sold for $50, which had all his secrets. And I wanted one very badly, but he wouldn't give it to me because I wasn't a magician. He only wanted it for magicians because it were his secrets. But I had one day asked him so much to teach me some trick, because I had tried magic when I was younger, and I was always frustrated because I couldn't do any of them. And I begged him to teach me the cut and restore, which is the very famous beginner magician's trick of taking a rope or a cord, cutting it and restoring it again. You've seen it many times, I'm sure. So I begged him to teach it to me, and he did. But I had just flown over, and I was full of jet lag, and I was sort of groggy. I'm using that as an excuse because I couldn't learn it. I tried and I fumbled, and I'm not good with my hands, and I couldn't say, please excuse me, I'm full of jet lag and I want to get to bed and sleep it off. But anyway, after that, he had no respect for me as a magician. So I felt very badly about it. But anyway, he came over to see me every time I visited my daughter, and I went once a year because my daughter lived in London at the time, and every year I came over for their birthday. So I always spent an hour or maybe more with Harbin on every visit. He told me about I did meet his wife too. She'd come over sometime, but she had to sit on some kind of a blown up pillow. She had been badly burned. I don't know exactly what it was. I've made my own scenario about it, but I might be wrong. I think that she helped him in his act, like all magicians have pretty girls in their act. And whether it was so far ago, so long ago, that they had lights instead of incandescent lights for footlights, I don't know. But she must have worn a dress that in some way caught fire. And she was very badly burned, and she spent months and months. As you know, it's a long recovery. And Harbin always must have felt very guilty about it, because I noticed that he was particularly attentive to his wife. He did bring her over to Rosalie's many times, but she wasn't interested in origami. In fact, she was always quarreling with him, was angry about it because he never made any money in it. It wasn't until he published a series of little books that he began to make a lot of money for the first time, because he did all his own drawings. He taught himself how to draw, and did all the drawings, and it was a small book, and it sold for very little, and it was a series, and it went number 1, 2, 3, 4, and I think then he died. But those books made a lot of money, and from that time on, she was very sympathetic about his wish to spend the time to do it, because it takes an awful lot of time. But anyway, when I first met him, he told me the story that he was in the hospital with his wife, and the librarian went by with a cart of books, and in it was this book, Paper Toy Making by Margaret Campbell. And he had gazed through it, flipped through it, and he saw that there were things made out of paper. Well, every magician uses paper in some form or another in his act. And he thought that he had discovered either something that was long known and forgotten, or else hadn't been introduced to the public yet. And he was terribly excited about it. And he began to do some of the foals, and he went through the book. And this was at the time that he had made the acquaintance of Gershon Legman in the south of France. And Gershon Legman knew Yoshizawa and knew a lot about what happened in certain countries and whether they had done the work, because in Spain they were working with paper too at a very early time. So it seems that Ned always slipped either a 10-pound note or a 5-pound note, I don't know how much, to Gershon Legman, and Gershon furnished him with a lot of information. Now that all came after his book, which was Paper Magic, I think I've shown it before, was ready to go to print. So he stuck it in anyway, whatever information he got from Legman, and so that makes his book very interesting to us, because so little is known about anything that happened in the olden times with the paper. So anyway, this is the book that Margaret Campbell wrote. She was at the time in her 90s. Her husband had business dealings with the Orient and took her every year on his business trips. So she used to come back with foals and entertained her grandchildren. And her son, Roy Campbell, who was a very famous poet, I understand, of yesteryear, importuned his mother to put it in book form for the benefit of his family later on. So that's how this book came out. It has a great many of the traditional folds. In fact, all of them are traditional, but it's a little bit difficult to follow because the directions are really not the best. It's very difficult to try to describe origami if you don't know the secret. And the secret is to use one of Mr. Yoshizawa's books, because his symbols are so clear. He has arrows and signs that undoubtedly tell you what to do when you don't need the Japanese language. So it would be a great advantage if everyone would use his signs and his symbols. But unfortunately, we've tried, but that have not been successful in that. We asked everybody in the beginning when we first started, and we were a few of us, to please use Mr. Yoshizawa's symbols whenever possible, so it would be one language that we would understand. Then nobody need to worry about the Japanese. But it seems that we cannot be successful in that. I had asked Toshiya Takahama if she would talk to several of the Japanese authors who were publishing books on origami to get together and agree, whatever it was, to use one sign language so that everybody would understand it. And there was a great argument among the four of them, each one claiming you should use my symbols, they're the best. And of course, we didn't think anyone's was better than Yoshizawa's. And they certainly wouldn't agree to do with his, because Yoshizawa has kept himself apart from all the other paper folders in Japan by saying that they did not do the real origami. He said to me through his interpreter one day, I do the real origami. If you do not know, if you do not do what I do, you are not doing the real origami. Now, anybody can take a piece of paper and fold it in half. It doesn't have to be his way of folding it in half. How many ways can there be? If you take your paper and fold it in half, even if it's from point to point or side to side, why aren't you doing the real origami? It's because he hasn't put his seal of approval on it. He's an extremely jealous man, because he is the only one who has devoted his entire life. I should have had one of his books, but he's written so many beautiful books. And his Yoshizawa's books have the most beautiful photography I've ever in my life seen. And his symbols are so clear that no one need have any hesitation about being able to follow his models. They are so beautiful. But nobody else will give in, so we have all kinds of a mishmash with it. However, I want to tell you about Claude Sarrasis. This is a book that originally was in a very large size, and the few people that I knew in origami talked about it, the few that had the good luck to see it. I was told that if I went to Chicago and went to the public library and asked to see it, they would take a key and go somewhere and come back with it, and you would be allowed to look at it in the presence of the librarian, and then you had to give it back. That the paintings were so beautiful in here that it was classified as, unfortunately she called it the ABCs of origami. And when I saw it in Chicago, and I did the same thing here in our library, public library, I asked to see it, and they took a key, and I had to wait while they got it, and then I was only allowed to see it in the presence of the librarian. The pictures are so absolutely charming, and I wanted so badly to get in touch with Sarrasis, Sarrasis. There's the crow, and you see he looks like he's actually grasping the tree trunk. And I happen to have a grandfather who was in the raw fur and hide business many, many years ago. And he had some customers in China and Japan, and when I asked if I could get this book, if it were still in print, if I could get it, I think we almost spent a leg and an arm to try to get it, but my grandfather had a customer, and the customer was nice enough to take his automobile and go up and down the streets, because the streets were marked so poorly in those days. The city had grown so quickly that they really didn't have a good way of marking their buildings. And so all he could do was go up and down and try to find out from neighbors where this woman lived. And finally he did get a book for me, and it was a very large book, and it was exactly this book. And it was a book I brought with me when I went to be interviewed on all the television stations, because it was such a beautiful book to show. And nobody, of course, had seen it. So I was anxious to get a hold of Claude Sarrasis to write to her. And I spoke to Sherry Lewis about it once when we were speaking, and she said she knew that Sarrasis Sarasis's father was an ambassador in France from their country, and I'm trying to think what country it was. It was one of the Oriental countries. That's just escaped me for the moment. So she got the address of this ambassador in Paris for me. And I wrote to him and told him that I was so interested that I'd opened the Origami Center of America, and that I had a copy of his daughter's beautiful work, and was there any way that I could get in touch with her? Would he give me the address? So he did. And it seems that her husband and she lived in Japan for a while. I think her husband was a teacher. And she said the Japanese people were so kind to her that she wrote this book and dedicated it to the, and we'll read the dedication in a moment. I'm just trying to show you how beautiful these photographs, or these pictures are. And she has them in 3 languages, English, French, and Japanese. And as you see, there are no words or no language other than a few pictures here. So unless you are well-versed in origami, you're not going to be able to do the models unless you're very clever. But this is the only thing I didn't like, because it didn't have Japanese faces. The children have American faces. And I did finally write to her, and the whole thing took about 5 years before I could get into correspondence with her. And she's a charming young woman, young mother, and told me that her daughter, one of her daughters, had contracted polio while in Japan. And the people were so kind to her all through this child's illness. That was just the way she repaid their kindness, by publishing a book. And I just want to see whether there is some notation in the beginning. I think this is this is Z, yes. See if there's something in the beginning that would tell us about, no, it's just my introduction that I had written here. So I don't see anything about that. But that's what she wrote to me, that she had done it in honor of the Japanese people. And I had a friend who was going up to Peter Van Noten. In fact, he edited some of the Origamians, the little newspaper that I got out. I must tell you about that too sometime. He was the editor for a short time, and he told me that he was going up to Vermont. Now, Charles Tuttle is a famous publisher who has been here for years and years. He's married to a Japanese woman, so he spends all his time in Japan, but he comes here for a few months during the summer. And Peter Van Noten said to me that he was going to make an automobile trip with his family for their vacation up to Vermont, and he expected to stop in at Tuttle's. And if he should have the good fortune to meet Mr. Tuttle himself, could he try to make arrangements in my behalf to have a book reproduced, this book reproduced? Because that was the only publisher we knew anything about who was here. So he did go up and he did speak to him, and I was in touch with Mr. Tuttle about reproducing the book. In the meantime, I had corresponded with Mrs. Sarasis, and she had sent me some of her paintings with origami, and she was just charming. And I suggested to her that we try to have the book reproduced, and she gave me the power to go ahead and do it. Anything that I could manage. Being so far away, I wasn't in contact with anybody. But Peter got me in contact with Mr. Tuttle, and I'm afraid I'm not a very good bargainer. He's a very strong businessman, and he knew where he could push his weight against somebody who was inexperienced, because I wanted to get something for her in cash. I wanted to get some monetary recognition from this wonderful book. Because when we tried to have it reproduced, she had given me permission to have it reproduced, they all objected to the name, the ABCs of origami, because children would never take a book out. A 10-year-old would never take an ABC book. He'd think that's a kindergarten book, and that wasn't what she meant. She just did it because she did every letter in the alphabet. She did an animal or an origami piece from. That was why she called it the ABCs. So Mr. Tuttle said he would publish it, but he certainly wasn't going to give any cash for it because it was just a reproduction. But he offered 25 books for the author. And I said, well, what's she going to do with 25 books? That's not enough compensation. But I couldn't budge him, and I wasn't with him. We all tried to do this all by letter. So I finally asked her if she'd be willing if it was reproduced without getting her any money, and she agreed. So when he reproduced it, he reduced it to the size. And I do believe it has sold pretty well because he's kept on publishing it right along. And if it hadn't sold, I guess he would have discontinued it. But it was such a beautiful book, and it was the one I took with me in every television station that I was at.